set right here in the middle of the peninsula, in these hills and valleys that we're sitting in and visiting today. And about 2 years and change of the 3-year, 1-month kinetic portion of this war was fought right in this area. That would leave us a dangerous legacy because they didn't gain or lose much territory. They would fight over a hill one day and lose it the next. So this yo-yo thing happened for a good 2 years. Every time somebody went backwards, they laid a whole bunch of landmines for the other guy to find. And so what we have today is a very heavily landmined area. And I'll explain that area in just a moment. But that's the dangerous legacy we have from that period, sadly. In 1951, they carved out a little space right here where we are. It says Panmunjom. That's the colloquial name, also called the Joint Security Area. It's about an 800-meter square. It sits astride the border, and that's where we're going to visit first this morning. And this area was carved out for negotiation and dialogue so they could work out a peace treaty. That was in 1951. Meanwhile, for 2 years, the war within a stone's throw is being fought very violently right around here. Some of the other sites we'll visit today, you'll see just how quickly, we'll just drive there every 5 minutes away. Some of the most hostile fighting happened in the Panmun Valley, just over, really just spit distance over there, so very close. That's how way it would be until July 27, 1953, which is when they signed the Armistice Agreement, or a ceasefire agreement. That was a military commander's agreement to stop shooting at each other. It was signed by Mark Clark. He was the commander-in-chief of the United Nations Command. He signed on behalf of that entire multinational coalition, not only the sending members who sent folks here, but also our host nation of the Republic of Korea. Pang Tae-hui signed for the Chinese People's Volunteers, and Kim Il-sung signed as the marshal of his armed forces, not as the head of state, but as the head of military. So the Armistice Agreement is a military commander's ceasefire agreement. The idea is to give the governments a buffer time to work out a peace treaty. 65 years later, still meant to give the buffer time for the governments to work out a peace treaty. So, and maybe we're getting closer. So, this may be the year. Keep our fingers crossed, but we'll see. Now, one thing I like to point out that my old boss used to say, Colonel Minnick used to say this, he would say that the worst day, and we've had some bad days, but the worst day under armistice conditions is still better than the best day under wartime conditions. So I'd like to say that the armistice in 6.5 decades has done largely what it was set out to do, and that is to preclude the resumption of hostilities. So if you boil down these points, that's basically what it would point to is a single sentence: preclude the resumption of hostilities. Very significant, the armistice is a very thin document, by the way. You could read it in 15, 20 minutes, so I always recommend it. It's all the subsequent agreements that came after the armistice was signed. If you can get through those, you're doing better than me, and I've been here 6 years. So, but the armistice agreement itself separated into 3 parts. Basically, it stops the shooting. It designates a time, they stop shooting. It separates the forces. My Marine Corps, my deceased Marine Corps dad was a first sergeant in the Marine Corps. He would say, you don't get in a bar fight if you're not in the bar. That makes sense. You keep people away from each other that are otherwise inclined to fight, then hopefully they won't fight. So we have some mechanisms here that do that. And then finally, it establishes commissions that implement these agreements that we made so long ago. So they stopped the shooting, and when they stopped, they essentially set up a de facto border. It's called the military demarcation line. It's this red line here in the middle. And I say de facto because there's no ratified peace treaty, which would be ratified border. This is the agreed upon separation line. And it essentially represents the forward line of troops on Armistice Day. So when they stop shooting at each other, this is where they're facing off. I kind of have this idea in my head that the company commanders probably on each side, they marched to the middle of the field somewhere and started arguing about feet and inches for a few minutes, and then they drove a white stake down in the ground, and they did that along the whole border, put up some signs here that say military demarcation line. There are no fences on this border, just these signs here. Not even all these signs are here. About 15% are left, I guess, of the original 1292 that were here. sidebar, side story, is we found one of them, a couple years ago, we found one of them patching a barn here in Taysorville. Piece of sheet metal, so, roger that. We'll be able to point out some of them. Most of them are all completely rusted over now, but, anyway, no fences on that border. There are fences, however, on the southern boundary and northern boundary of the demilitarized zone. This one's, most people are more familiar with this one. The demilitarized zone is a buffer on the border to keep the two sides from facing off each other. It's 2 kilometers either side, so 4 kilometers wide, about 245 kilometers, about 148 miles long. And the idea was that nothing military would be inside that area, except for about 1,000 troops on either side, which would act as kind of a border patrol. And the very short story here is both sides started cheating immediately. And so sadly, what we have today is a very inaptly named zone, because square inch for square inch, this is the most militarized zone on the planet. And it's never been demilitarized. All those landmines I mentioned, there's an estimated 2 million landmines that still exist inside the DMZ. And just, this was education for me when I first got here, because I don't know nothing about landmines. But landmines don't have a shelf life. They're ready to blow up anytime. The casing may have a shelf life, but the explosive doesn't necessarily. So you got to treat them all like they're active. And we do hear them go off for animals, weather. Sadly, every now and again, somebody gets a foot blown off or something. But I want you to feel secure, because the areas that we're going to today, we re-clear up to twice a year, depending on where we're going. So nothing like that. But stay close. The commissions that were set up to establish, to implement all of those agreements, there were 3, and I'll start with the bottom one here, the Repatriation Commission. This is how to give POWs back at the end of the day. It was led by the Indian delegation of the neutral nations, and they were set up on, basically the POWs were lined up either side of the border across a bridge. They were given the opportunity to choose which Korea they wanted to move to, and they could cross the bridge if they wanted. But they couldn't come back. So the bridge gets the nickname the Bridge of No Return. We'll be able to show you that today, as well as, this is news to me, and you may have known this, sir, but we often call one of those silver buildings up on Conference Row, we often call it the KPA Recreation Building. That's actually the old Indian Constabulary building of the Repatriation Commission. So it's owned by the KPA, so we can't go in it, but you might have a key at the DMZ. The Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission comes later, and they are basically a neutral voice on either side, and they were supposed to add international credibility for both sides. They were kind of a neutral voice for inspections, investigations, and violations of the Armistice Agreement, and they were sort of an independent reporting agency. Once again, the short story is we end up with the Swiss and Swedes on our side, and we still have them. The North side had the Czechs and the Poles until the Soviet Union dissolved, so right around their side of the JSA since 1970. And so he was taking a tour on that side. He decides to make a run for it. He bolts across, and at that point, this garden area was a sunken garden. And he takes cover in there, and the North Koreans followed him over here, and there was a firefight, a shootout. And sadly, one of our security battalion soldiers was killed just on the other side of, if you see that army truck over there, just on the other side of that is a monument dedicated to Corporal John. He lost his life. An American got shot in the cheek, but lived. And then there were 4 KPA that were killed, and in this firefight. And after about 30 minutes, the firefight stopped, and they were able to drag their dead back over to the North Korean side. And the Soviet defector was taken south. He was decided to immigrate to America, where he spent his career at the San Francisco Chronicle. And he gave a report one time. He was so happy to have been free, but he was also extremely saddened by the fact that there was a loss of life because of his bolt for freedom. And that stayed with him his whole life. He ended up passing just a couple years ago. But anyway, that's his story, the Soviet defection.
not so much an issue of straight across this way anymore, but we have had a recent defection on November 13th of this past year. And we're going to slowly crawl up this way. Basically, that happened on this side of the building. So this little knoll up here. And as you look at the retaining wall just on the other side of the Freedom House here, that's where the defector, who was a KPA soldier, his name was Staff Sergeant O, collapsed because he'd been shot 5 times. And that's where the security battalion personnel went, retrieved him, and got him to safety and hospital treatment, and he's living, he's doing quite well, as a matter of fact, so it's good. All right. And as we take a slow turn around the garden here, I mentioned that defection happened right here. This building right here, in front of us, is the Republic of Korea's Peace House. This is where the most recent summit is. If you saw any of that on television, that's where that occurred. That was it. And now, mostly resident in that building is another ministry. The ministry, actually the Korean National Intelligence Service resides in there, but that's where they have the inter-Korean talks that are not armistice related. Corporal Jong's memorial stone is right over here on the other side of that truck there. Kim Jong-un and President Moon.
Can we take a picture?
Yes, you may. Please keep all pictures towards the north. And while we're here, I'll kind of show you the white stakes behind the tree, and that's the border. So everything north of that is North Korea. We'll get out on conference row in just a few minutes, but this is kind of, we'll pause here and show you the tree. The tree, when it was planted, they used soil from both North Korea and South Korea, and then they used water from the Taeping River in Pyongyang. That's the one that runs through Pyongyang, and the Han River. So it was funny, I was sitting up in the office here when they were doing it with the general, and he says, "Man, I hope that Han River water is clean, the tree doesn't die, that'd be awful." So that would be awful, but I think the tree's going to do quite well.
Alright, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Conference Row. This is the official meeting place between North and South Korea. All the blue buildings in this area belong to the United Nations Command, or the UNC, while all the gray and silver buildings belong to the KPA, or North Korea. Starting off to your immediate right, you have the tall 3-story blue building that is the JDO building, the Joint Duty Officer building. And the JDO serves as an official representative of the United Nations Command, Military Officers Commission, and he also conducts official communications between the KPA and the UNC. At the base of the hill in front of the JDO building, you'll see some white stakes that denote the MDL throughout the Joint Security Area, and then it continues on behind me to Conference Row in the form of a 17 by 5 inch slab that bisects each building between the two Koreas. On top of the hill from those white stakes, you see the KPA Tower Number 2, which is currently monitoring us at this time. So please, for your safety, please do not point, gesture, wave, anything of this nature. Closer to us, you have the KPA Recreational Facility, which Lieutenant Commander McShane described. Like he said, it has no recreational equipment in it and is seldom used by North Korea. And then to the left of that is the T3 building, used for all colonel and staff officer level talks. And then to the left of that is the T2 MAC building, which we will receive a separate briefing in shortly. To the left of that is the T1 building.
They're chosen for a number of skills they have. The ROK soldiers all practice martial arts, and they're all black belts and normally Taekwondo. As PFC said, they're standing in a modified Taekwondo stance. It's called ROK Ready because it pretty much, one, it allows them to stand in that position for a good long time if they need to, but two, it also lets them react to pretty much anything. So we're real proud of these guys. If you're so inclined to take a photo with them, this may be the closest you ever get to them. So you might be able to do that. As I mentioned, they're all hand selected to be up here, and you know, we have a few amenities up here now, but I like to say that these all of these gentlemen up here in the security battalion, they give up a fair amount to come up here, to be stationed up here, because we just don't have that much. So their counterparts, for instance, down in Seoul, may be able to go get a burger at night or something like that. Not these guys. And they work hard, and we don't give them enough credit or enough.
Bridge of No Return, which obtained its name at the end of the Korean War, when Operation Big Switch and Operation Little Switch were both conducted. During these operations, the UNC returned approximately 82,000 prisoners of war to the north, and the KPA and the PVA returned approximately 13,000 to the south. The POWs were lined up on either side of the bridge, and they were given the opportunity to cross into the country of their choice. However, once they did so, they were not allowed to turn back, hence the name for the Bridge of No Return. And the last Americans to cross this bridge were Commander Bucher and his crew of the USS Pueblo in 1968. After being held captive in North Korea for almost a full year, it was around 11 and a half months, they crossed, and their ship, the USS Pueblo, is still on display in Pyongyang to this day.
Ridiculous thought right now, but in the 60s, when North Korea was economically superior to South Korea, and they had to support the Soviet Union, and South Korea had an industrial revolution, they built this village to kind of show off what a pristine socialist village looks like, in order to attract defections to the north. Kim Il-sung really believed that there was a popular uprising waiting to happen. The buildings are largely fake. There's no floors in the tall buildings. Some of the windows are painted on, doors are painted on. There's no glass in the windows, that kind of thing. There's no electricity or plumbing in the village, but it had its heyday, because down here they were living hand to mouth, and up there they had at least some socialist stake in the, you might have the same price. It was a very attractive idea, and that was until the 90s. The Soviet paycheck stopped coming. South Korea industrializes very quickly with the help of the Western world. They change places almost overnight, and now it seems like the comic like that. But they keep it standing because to take it down or something like that would be to concede the fact that it was fake. They may have it. This is the little gift shop that is open here. They may have that kind of thing here. You can look for it if you like to. But for right now, what I'd like to do is invite you off the bus. So I think we're going to congregate right here, get a small brief before anybody who would like to go in the tunnel will go. Leave your bags, please. You can bring your cameras, but not inside the tunnel. So there are free to use.
North Korea secretly built hidden tunnels under the DMZ with the intention of invasion. During the 1970s, with the help of defectors, some of these tunnels were discovered. It is believed more tunnels still exist and are yet to be found.